Okay. Thanks, Sipla, for giving me this wonderful platform and a wonderful flyer. Basically, the topic today is about the management of dry eye in a basic ophthalmic setup. Is this topic relevant? Is dry eye so prevalent in India? Jivan Singh Tityal et al. In their study have said that there is 32 prevalence of dry eye among 21 to 40-year-olds in North Indian population. Whereas, should we consider this as a study or an observation of 14.5 lakh patients over a period of 7 years in Telugu states, Karnataka and Orissa, they have found about only 21,000 cases of dry eye. That amounts to 1.46%. North seems to be going up north and south seems to be going down south. Uh, However, the same study has said that the prevalence in South India too will increase to 40% among the urban population by 2030. So, indeed, it's prevalent in Indian population. So, okay, it's prevalent. Is this of nuisance value? Does it cause significant morbidity? When I first read this, the morbidity in dry eye is similar to that of a morbidity caused by severe angina. First, I thought this couldn't be true, but well, there is a study to back it. That is Schiffman et al. Study. So, coming to the definition of dry eye, dry eye is a disorder of the tear film due to tear deficiency or excessive tear evaporation, which causes damage to the interpalpebral ocular surface and is associated with the symptoms of ocular discomfort. Pretty straightforward, no issues there. But the thing is, as we aged, as we saw different inflammatory markers and all these things, a need arose to modify this definition. And the latest definition is like this: it's a multifactorial disease of the ocular surface characterized by loss of homeostasis of tear film accompanied by ocular symptoms in which tear film instability, hyperosmolarity, ocular surface inflammation, and etiological roles. Pretty complicated, but basically what this has done is it has recognized the role of loss of homeostasis and the resultant vicious cycle of chronic inflammation and ocular surface as the basic fundamental aspects of dry eye pathology. These neurosensory abnormalities were added in 2017. So, I mean, coming to the basics, basically we all know that and innermost mucin layer is about 0.05 microns. Basically, this is the thinnest layer, and you can say that 99% of tear film is only aqueous. But the thing is, the mucin layer, what it does is it sticks onto the glycocalyx of the epithelial villi, and it makes the hydrophobic surface. Basically, it makes it hydrophobic. Tear film is not absorbed; it's adsorbed onto the cornea. Know the difference. And functions, as you all know, tear film helps in oxygenation of the cornea, nutrition, smooth refractory surface, and removal of debris. Smooth refractory surface is important because once the smoothness of the refractory surface goes, it leads to high order aberrations, as you see in the dry eyes. So, I mean, I found this slide very interesting because you see, forget about all the complexities. You see the innervation. Basically, this shows the simultaneous innervation of lacrimal gland and the meibomian gland. This makes sense because the tear film is a composite thing and you require a coordination between different glands to produce it. So, a simultaneous innervation makes sense. Coming to the basic anatomy, the lacrimal innervation is by the sensory innervation is by the lacrimal nerve, and this is important innervation, the most important innervation rather, the parasympathetic innervation. Parasympathetic innervation starts with the superior cervical ganglion. We have in ophthalmology two parasympathetic ganglions, the Edinger-Westphal nucleus and the superior cervical ganglion. One is associated with the third nerve, and this with the seventh nerve. The preganglionic fiber starts from there. They go to the greater petrosal nerve of pterygoid canal, and finally end in the pterygopalatine ganglion. The postganglion fibers start from there, and they join the zygomatic nerve to innervate the lacrimal gland. And sympathetic basically all the sympathetic starts from only one place, superior cervical ganglion. They go to the greater petrosal nerve, and from there they take the same course as the parasympathetic nerves. And what you have to mainly remember is parasympathetic system stimulates the lacrimal glands, lacrimal fluid secretion, whereas sympathetic stimulation inhibits the lacrimal fluid secretion. So basically, we can classify this dry eye as an aqueous deficient dry eye or an evaporative dry eye. Aqueous deficient is a deficiency basically. So basically, this deficiency could be Sjogren's. It should be spelled as Sjogren's. Sjogren's or non-Sjogren's. Sjogren's is a primary Sjogren's is a very rare disease. Even in the Western society, it's very rare disease. And secondary Sjogren's is spillover, basically a spillover caused by rheumatoid arthritis and all these connective tissue disorders are all secondary Sjogren's. And non-Sjogren's causes of aqueous deficiency could be hormonal, could be medications and all these things which cause an aqueous tear deficiency. And basically evaporative, and this is MGD. People confuse this MGD with meibomian gland disease. This is not meibomian gland disease. This is meibomian gland dysfunction. Dysfunction means previously the gland functioned well, now it's not functioning. So basically MGD could be caused by many things, but this is the most prevalent form of dry eye, and the most prevalent form of MGD is obstruction of the meibomian ducts. And other causes, for example, environmental causes, computer vision syndromes, and all these things, they also cause evaporative dry eye. And basically, this is a beautiful thing. This is a beautiful this one flow chart. I borrowed it from internet, and this shows the pathophysiology in a most beautiful way. The upper part is the evaporative part of the dry eye. The lower part is the aqueous insufficiency, aqueous deficiency of the dry eye. Both meet to cause the loss of homeostasis, that is tear osmolality. And this tear osmolality will signaling molecules. This stimulates the signaling molecules. These signaling molecules will produce cytokines, and these cytokines basically, if anybody asks you only one thing, dry eye is a chronic inflammatory disease. If you want answer it in a one way, it's a chronic inflammatory disease. What this does is, this inflammation, again, this damages the ocular surface, and the other way it damages the corneal nerves. Once in the initial part, this is interesting. In the initial part, the initial stimulation, there is a reflex hypersecretion of the tears, but as the damage goes on, the block occurs. So basically, all these are the etiological factors. I will come to that later. So what causes dry eye? Inflammation, as I said earlier, inflammation, autoimmune diseases, Sjogren's, rheumatoid arthritis, polymyositis, and all these things. Hormonal imbalance, I have got a separate slide on that. Environmental conditions, any condition that causes low humidity, high airflow over the eyes, they cause dry eyes. Medications, all these medications, basically your antihypertensives, your antihistaminics, your anti-psychiatric medicines, and the most importantly, your eye drops, all these things, they cause dry eye. Systemic diseases, as I said earlier, this one, autoimmune diseases and systemic diseases, you can add diabetes mellitus, thyroid diseases for this. And the last thing is, you can cause these as iatrogenic also, basically this cataract surgery, refractive surgery, and all these things which disturb the innervation, corneal innervations. So this is interesting. Ophthalmology per se has become an all women branch. We have got especially we have got all women conferences also, and dry eye is also more prevalent in women. So why is it more prevalent in women? Decrease of androgens. Yes, you heard it right. Androgen is the basic substrate from which estrogens are created. Androgens by aromatase enzyme are created into estrogen. So basic starting point is the androgen. With the age, androgens decrease even in women. Women tend to wear makeup, and this makeup will have detergents and many irritants. They cause dry eye. And one more point: this androgen stimulates lacrimal secretion, whereas estrogen inhibits the lacrimal secretion. In estrogen also metalloproteinases, it increases the metalloproteinases. So in the double whammy way. And for example, if a woman is on hormonal replacement therapy, you are not giving any androgens, you are giving plain estrogens there. So you have decreased the estrogens and you have increased the you have decreased the androgens and you have increased the estrogens. So this is a double whammy effect resulting in dry eye. And makeup, detergents in makeup, they cause dry eye. And moreover, women don't want to suffer unnecessarily. They seek attention earlier. So men may have dry eye, but women may be seeking attention earlier. And as you all know, all these connective tissue disorders are more in women. So all these points put together, dry eye will be more in women. So, what are the symptoms with which the patient presents to us? The patient presents to us with a foreign body sensation. He could feel his own eyes. He will be aware of his own eyes. Ocular burning, itching, photophobia, and blurred vision. And this is something like an oxymoron, a lacrimation or watery eyes. On one side you are saying dry eye, and the other side you are saying lacrimation. I am a bit fan of this. But I thought I am making this up, but I am pleasantly surprised when I saw speed questionnaire having this lacrimation as one of the symptoms. But it's important not to overdo it. I mean, a couple of days back, 10 days back, I got a patient. She has been to so many places. Her basic complaint is foreign body sensation with watering. So I thought, I have got, I have made a point to score our other doctors. So I looked at the T-but, I looked at the basic staining of the cornea. Cornea took up some stain, and T-but is less than 10 seconds. I thought I am treating a dry eye, and I gave her the medication. But later on, when she came yesterday, and she said subjectively she is okay, but the watering didn't go. Then I asked her. Then I asked the question which I should ask very earlier: does she have water in her eyes? Are the water dribbling out? Basically, these are two very important points. Watery eyes is different from water dribbling out of the eye. Water dribbling out of the eye occurs in the lacrimal punctal obstructions and these obstructions. Basic watering of the eyes can be, watery eyes could be there in dry eye. Then I did syringing for that patient, and both eyes there is regurgitation from the same punctum. I swallowed my ego and sent the patient to an ENT surgeon. Okay. Coming to the management, basically, if you are into a dry eye, if you are into a dry eye specialty, you can do these things. Ocular surface disease index questionnaire and speed questionnaire you can do. But in a routine practice, what you do is, in routine practice, you can ask the patient. Most pertinent question will be, how often are you getting these symptoms? Are you getting this once a week, twice a week, or regularly? And the thing is, so that gives us an indication of the severity of the disease. And then history taking is very important. Ask the patient on which medications he or she is on, any systemic diseases, diabetes mellitus, thyroid, and everything. Any history of contact lens wear, previous ocular procedures. And slit lamp examination. This is the most basic thing you have to do. Look at the lids. Look for any blepharitis, and then look at the meibomian orifices. Normally, they are not so prominent. Meibomian orifices are not so prominent, but in MGD, these plugging and the blocked orifices become more prominent than in a regular patient. Press on them. Press them against the globe, and see the meibum coming out. Basically, it will be like an olive oil. But in these patients, it will be some turbid. Basically, it will be turbid, and even in the worst cases, it won't come out. It will be insipated. And look for telangiectasias, ocular rosaceas. You will find some vessels on them, basically, and look at the margins. Some margins at times will be roughened. Look for ectropion, entropion. And this thing, I routinely see in most of the patients is the foaming in the near the interpalpebral near the lids, and blepharitis. I have seen in so many cases this foaming. And this is a small video regarding this insipated meibomian, this one, meibum. The toothpaste sign, what they call the toothpaste sign. This is both the diagnostic and even therapeutic too. Have a look. Next. Then the basics, and another thing I want to add is under the slit lamp examination, look at the cornea, look for corneal thinnings, look for any vascularization of the cornea, and most importantly, look at the conjunctiva. Ask the patient to abduct the eye and look for the conjunctival folds. Most what happens in conjunctival cirrhosis, you will see prominent folds of the conjunctiva. Look at them, and then now coming about with the dye examination, slit lamp and examination using a dye and examining with slit lamp. Basically, these are the dyes which you use: sodium fluorescein, rose bengal, lasmine green. I want to add a few points about sodium fluorescein. Basically, it's a fluorescent dye. That means if you stimulate it with a particular light, it emits a higher wavelength light, basically. So that's called fluorescence. And this we observe with a cobalt blue light. And this is important point. You should observe this in a high illumination. And some more points. Actually, if you want to do a fluometry test, you want to do something dilution of the fluorescent and everything, you should instill the correct amount of dye. What is the correct amount of dye? Actually, it should be 2 microliters of the dye, of 2% dye should be instilled. But in our normal setups, it may be possible in institute, but not with us. What we regularly use are impregnated strips. And if you see the strip, that will be orange red in color. Dilute them. Put a saline or topical anesthetic on that. It will change into a light yellow, something like a yellow color. It will appear something like an yellow color. And then again, when you see it with cobalt blue, this appears as a green color. Indeed, fluorescent has got many colors. And basically, how to set up the patient? If possible, you should use only normal saline, but that will be sting the patient more. So first, use topical anesthetics. Put a drop of topical anesthetic. Wait for 1 minute. Wipe it off, and then put a drop of saline on the strip, in the impregnated fluorescent strip. And one thing is, somehow I noted that it sticks to the fluid, the drop which you put, it sticks to the strip. So you flip it off, and then touch the lower bulbar conjunctiva, and ask the patient to blink twice and stop blinking. And now we go to the T-Bud test. So T-Bud, as I said, you should ask the patient to blink twice and then stop blinking, and you should use a high illumination cobalt blue light. And basically, you look at the black dots which are appearing. That when the tear film breaks up, you get the black dots. They should appear randomly. If, for example, a black dot is appearing at the same place repeatedly many times, maybe that's there is a corneal defect at that position. They should appear randomly. And remember that these breaks can be dot breaks, line breaks, or area breaks. It need not be specifically dot breaks. They could appear as line breaks also, and area breaks. And this tear film, normal tear film, anywhere between 11 to 40. Some books even give 11 to 40 seconds as the normal tear film, and less than 10 seconds you can take it as the pathognomic of evaporative dry eye. Small video regarding that. You could see those dots appearing, and you can later see the line appearing also. Here you can see the line break. You can consider this as an area break also. So basically, these breaks need not appear as dots. They can appear as lines. They can appear as a total area of the break. And this is interesting. This video shows the importance of using a high illumination during the cobalt blue, this sodium fluorescent examination. This is a 25-year-old patient and a normal patient. You don't expect any tear deficiency in these patients. But once I saw this patient, I thought he has got a lower meniscal height. But see what happens when I increase the illumination. And these are the corneal stains on the cornea which you can see. You can see SPKs, you can see filamentary keratitis, you can see areas of stain. And this is for what you can say, this is for institutional practice, or you may say. But one thing you have to remember is fluorescein basically stains cornea well. If you want to say stain conjunctiva, you have to use lasmine green or rose bengal. Rose bengal stings more, so you can preferably use lasmine green. And once again, coming back to the point, once you are using rose bengal, you should use white light and high illumination. Once you are using lasmine green, white light and low illumination. Hermas test. A dedicated filter paper of 5 mm into 35 mm is placed in the lower fornix, and it's measured after 5 minutes. People do it differently, and I never did it. I put this slide. Basically, if it is you read it after 5 minutes, and basically anything less than 5 mm is a severely impaired secretion. But the many factors alter that. The room, the fan in your room, and everything basically alters this. But once you get a reading of less than 10 mm, definitely you can suspect tear aqueous deficiency, tear deficiency. So that completes the basic things you can do in practices like mine. Basically, and these are all specialties. And once you are aiming to incorporate maybe this one dry eye into your practice, you may like to do these things also. Basically, what happens, dry eye is a hyperosmolar disease, so it makes sense for you to measure the tear osmolarity. If the tear osmolarity is above anything between about 308 or 316 milliosmolars per liter, it's diagnostic of dry eye. And basically dry eye is an inflammatory disease, as we all know. One word is it's chronic inflammation. So it makes sense to measure the matrix metalloproteinases, especially MMP9, and any value more than 40 nanograms per milliliter is pathognomic of dry eye. Both these things could be done in on handheld machines, and both these things are reimbursable by insurance in US. And coming to meibumography is a photography of the meibomian glands. Basically, what we use is we use an infrared camera to take the photograph of these things. If you don't have, you can use your AR to take the picture of them. Though the pictures won't be great, but you can appreciate the meibomian glands. Coming to the meibomian glands, mostly they are about 50 in the upper lid and about 30 in the lower lid. And those who have a DSLR adapter camera can readily make a meibomography, make it what you can say, meibography ready by installing an infrared filter for that filter. And anyhow DSLR cameras can take infrared images. So once if you buy an infrared filter and you have a DSLR adaptable sweat lamp, you can take these photos. And basically you can these meibomian glands, they die off with the age. And basically this grading is from 0 to grade 3. 0 is no loss, and grade 3 is about 75% loss of meibomian glands. So and still more tests if you want to do, you can do tear mucin, hexosamine content, which basically tells about your tear mucin. You can take a biopsy and count the goblet cells. And this is interesting. Corneal topography could be used in dry eye, but basically it's not a basic dry eye tool. But you can use corneal topography in basic dry eye. And in dry eye shows inferior steepening of the cornea, something like keratoconus. It will show inferior steepening due to the accumulation of the epithelial cells at that point. And but basic corneal topography is not for dry eye. So, I mean, I have put this slide, not that I base my treatment on these things, but to show you basically that the dry eye is basically, it's more of signs than symptoms. Is you see here, this is severe dry eye and the patient is becoming symptomatic at this point. So when you take the mild dry eye, he has only mild conjunctival signs. That means only your lasmine green or your rose bengal will show some signs at this point. Normal streamers, a near normal T-bud. Then moderate dry eye, then you can your fluorescein may show some corneal stains. So basically, and when the patient becomes symptomatic, he is already moderate or even at least moderately, he has already got moderate dry eye. So now coming to the medical management, tear substitutes. Basically, these form the crux of our treatment. Basically, the most of our treatments are tear substitutes, and then you can there will be immunomodulators, there will be anti-inflammatory drugs, there will be tetracycline derivatives, omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin D. So what these are called tear substitutes are artificial tears, but let's consider, I mean, are they really tear substitutes or are they close to tears? Tears contain 3 layers: lipid, meibomian layer, mucin, aqueous layer, all the 3 layers, and it contains lactoferrin, lysozyme, and hundreds of other proteins. What these contain? They are basically polymers with electrolytes and maybe some gelling agents. That's all. So there is a large difference between natural tears and artificial tears. Natural tears are indeed priceless. You can't buy them, literally and figuratively. So I mean, so what do you expect from an ideal tear substitute? It should be isotonic. It should have a pH between 6.5 to 7.6. It should be compatible with the natural components of the tears. Should not alter the clarity of vision. Should be preservative free. So basically, you can't get everything in one. Ideal things can't exist in nature. There will be trade-offs. So basic drugs, what we see in the market are basically could be grouped like this: cellulose ethers, carbomers, polyvinyl alcohol, sodium hyaluronate, and povidone. So the most common things are cellulose ethers, your carboxymethyl cellulose, your hyprolose, and all these things, they come out of this. These are basically, they are polysaccharides, viscoelastic polysaccharides. They increase the viscosity of tears, and sometimes they are co-formulated by electrolytes. They have good retention time on the ocular surface. They mix well with other ones. When the patient is using some other drops, they mix well. This viscosity is not influenced by blinking, but the downside is they form debris. Even in our cataract surgery in HPMC, what we use, at times you find debris, basically these cellulose debris. So similarly, CMC, they may form debris. So these carbomers, polyacrylic acid, these have the highest viscosity, and if you want good retention time, you can go for them. This polyvinyl alcohol, see, this is the sorry. This has got the low viscosity and most wetting. So basically, if you want a wetting agent, basically wetting agent, and if you are not bothered about the retention time, you can go with polyvinyl alcohols. This is interesting. Sodium hyaluronate. This is interesting. Actually, many studies have suggested that a cluster differentiating protein 44 is which is a receptor protein for sodium hyaluronate, is expressed more in the cases of dry eyes. And once these patients are treated with sodium hyaluronate, the epithelial healing occurred. So this is a ocular surface modifying drug, sodium hyaluronate. So it has got a good retention time. These mucopolysaccharides are glycosaminoglycans, you can call them. This is a viscous formulation, and this modifies the surface. This is a surface modifying agent. This helps in corneal wound healing. And finally, this could be used with the polyvinyl alcohol, and basically useful in mucin layer deficiencies. And these are osmoprotectants. What are osmoprotectants? Basically, once you put this is a hyperosmolar, you should know that this is a hyperosmolar condition. Dry eye is a hyperosmolar condition. Once you put a dry eye, for that moment, the hyperosmolarity comes down. But but that's a transient phase. So how to protect, basically how to protect the corneal epithelium from this hyperosmolarity? These are the answers. This hyperosmolarity, what it does is hyperosmolarity increases the oxidative stress. So it swells up the epithelial cells. So how to protect this? Basically, you use these drugs. They increase the antioxidative enzymes. Antioxidative enzymes and they protect the corneal epithelium from the oxidative stress. And within these, glycerol has got the least acting time. And combined with L-carnitine and all these things, the efficacy, the acting time increases. And coming to preservatives, thimerosal is not being used now. What the most common benzoyl chloride, cetrimide, and polyquat. These are quaternary ammonium compounds. These BAK may be the most commonly used thing you come across. And this is interesting. Preservative free. Are they really preservative free? They are not preservative free. The other name for them are this one noble preservatives. Basically, what they are preservatives. They themselves are also cytotoxic, but the thing is they break up into normal constituents of tears when administered. And basically BAK is the fall guy, has become the fall guy because it is more extensively studied. Not that SOC and sodium perborate will cause the toxicity for the epithelium. They do cause, but BAK is more extensively studied, and of course SOC and sodium perborate may cause less, but they also cause certain corneal epithelial toxicity. The other agents are chlorhexidine, boric acid, and bigonides. So what are immunomodulators? Again, coming back to the same point, basically dry eye is a chronic inflammatory disease. So immune modulators do play a role. Cyclosporin is the most common thing which we use after these basic tear substitutes. You use cyclosporin. It's made up of from a fungus, and basically it inhibits the calcium urine, and subsequently reduces the interleukin 2, interleukin 4, and interleukin 12. This potential is clearly demonstrated in studies. Use of cyclosporin has resulted in increased tear secretions. So basically, again, it proves that the dry eye is basically an inflammatory disease. The thing is that it should be used at least for 6 months. Basically, for the effect to be shown, at least it will take 2 to 3 months, and these two should be used at least for 6 months. That should be kept in mind. And coming to my favorite, actually, corticosteroids. Corticosteroids in ophthalmology are the basic go-to drugs. Basically, you take any condition, you take except barring from fungal ulcers or herpes, epithelial herpes. In all conditions, in endophthalmitis, be it in endophthalmitis, be it in this one gram-negative corneal ulcers, these corticosteroids are used. But once you say corticosteroids give a negative connotation. Basically, oh, corticosteroids. But remember, these give the quickest symptomatic relief. But as we know the adverse effects of these ones, we use them as a pulse therapy for 2 to 3 weeks. We will prime the tissue and then let something like cyclosporins take on from there. Basic mechanism is they decrease the inflammatory cytokines and chemokines. They decrease the matrix metalloproteinases. They decrease the lipid mediators of inflammation. Those are prostaglandins. And these are also the mainstay of my treatment. I add doxycycline for every patient whom I suspect dry eye. And basically, this acts as an anti-inflammatory, and it's also an antibacterial. They decrease collagenases, phospholipases, matrix metalloproteinases, inhibits angiogenesis. This inhibition of angiogenesis is important in ocular rosacea. And doxycycline is a semi-synthetic tetracycline derivative. Apart from the above things, what it does is it increases the corneal surface regularity and it improves the barrier function. 2 or 3 points you should note about when you are administering doxycycline is dairy products, milk products, buttermilk, and everything. They inhibit the absorption of doxycycline from the gut. So instruct the patient not to consume these dairy products for 1 hour after taking a doxycycline. And other thing is, normally tetracyclines are not given to children below 8 years because they stain the teeth. Doxycycline is not to cause that thing, but it's better safe be sorry. Also now coming to vitamin D. Vitamin D is the in thing nowadays after COVID. So vitamin D's role in preventing the cytokine storm is noted nowadays due to COVID. So similarly, as the even dry eye is a cytokine storm, basically vitamin D may have a role, and you can estimate vitamin D in the patient, and if the patient is found to be lacking vitamin D, there are 60,000 international units of vitamin D capsules available. You can give the patient one tablet for 6 weeks, once per week for 6 weeks. Essential fatty acids also act by regulating the inflammation. Basically, they regulate the lipid mediator inflammation. Secretox, basically what they do is they promote the secretion of tears. So this cevilamine, oral pilocarpine, and all these things, they increase the tear secretion. And mucolytic agents. Basically, what happens is in dry eye there is accumulation of mucus. Basically, I don't understand the mechanism of what I think is basically there is an increase of this mucus, and this acetylcysteine helps in the degradation of the mucus. These are the most important things other than the medical medicines you give. This is the most important thing in management of dry eye: hot compress and lid massage. Even the fancier things that have evolved nowadays have evolved from these things: hot compress and lid massage. What is hot compress? What is hot fermentation? Hot compress is using dry heat. Hot fermentation is using moist heat. Basically, hot compress in case of dry eye, it should be done at 108 degrees Fahrenheit, and it should be done with 10 for 10 minutes twice a day. This hot compressor should be done like that. My preferred way is, I say that ఉడుకుడుకు అన్నం ఉడకంగానే ఒక చిన్న గుడ్డలో తీసుకొని అది ఇట్లా గుడ్డని రౌండ్గా చుట్టేసుకొని దాన్ని కళ్ళ మీద పెట్టమని చెప్తాను. ఎందుకంటే వాటర్లో గుడ్డ ముంచి గుడ్డ తీసి బయటకి తీసి మళ్ళీ గుడ్డ, సో యూ రిక్వైర్ టు మెయింటైన్ 108 degrees Fahrenheit, and maybe I feel that that temperature is not maintained by this one, by this hot water, this one, and compress rather. And lid massage and subsequent lid massage also should be done. And basically, as you know, the basic dry eye is meibomian gland orifices blockage. You do these two things, you have the patient gets so much of relief. And then you can if there is a seborrhea, if there is anything, you can advise the lid hygiene. And these humidifying glasses, basically what it does is it increases the moisture, it increases the humidity around the eyes, and it decreases the dry eye. And punctal plugs is basically the retention of whatever the fluid is there in the eye. Basically, you want it to stay there. You doesn't want it to drain. And this is you can do even in your practice. Basically, what you can do is you can take a 2-0 catgut. You can introduce into the punctum. It seals the punctum very well, and it's also a temporary. Anyhow, the catgut dissolves. So environmental changes. If the patient is a software guy in an AC environment, you can advise environmental changes. So these are the new kids on the block. I don't want to go deep into this because I am not planning anything of this sort. And but these things basically act something like hot compress only. They generate endogenous heat. They even massage the lid, and basically finally they get the mebum out. And basically I think they basically work similar to a hot compress and this thing, but more sophisticated. And IPL is another thing. It's being marketed nowadays with the total cost comes up about I came across this in another group. They said that it's about 7.5 lakhs, and you can recuperate your costs. Basically, if you are an urban based, if you have a patient clientele for that, basically you can charge about 3,500 to 4,000-5,000, and you can recuperate your expenditure pretty quickly. That's what they said in that webinar. I don't have any idea about this. And just for an addition, I have added this one, this parotid duct transplantation, dorsotherapy, and all these things. But one thing, when the patient comes to this extent, it's not for a basic ophthalmologist to deal with these things. And see, let's take special conditions: glaucoma and dry eye. Both these things increase with dry eye. Glaucoma robs vision, but it's a silent killer. It's know that it doesn't cause a drastic drop of vision suddenly. It silently robs vision. So the patient is not bothered about glaucoma. But if this patient by glaucoma drops, if he develops a dry eye, basically he is aging, and if the glaucoma drops, the BAK in the glaucoma drops increases his dry eye, there may be compliance issues. So, I don't think any glaucoma preparation has come up with purite or sodium berberate, but if possible, give that, or add a preservative for the glaucoma patients. It will improve the compliance. And coming this very important topic, dry eye and diabetes. You see, diabetes affects every possible organ. Every possible organ is affected by diabetes, and diabetes kills more people. Even in this COVID year, I think diabetes has killed more people than COVID. So there is increased prevalence of dry eye in diabetics. Beaver Dam study has said that 20% of diabetics have got dry eye, and different studies have said that there is 17% to 25% prevalence depending on the NPDR. If you are an NPDR patient, they are about 17%. If you are a PDR patient, there is a 25% chance of them, 25% of them have dry eyes. So basically, it's so prevalent in diabetics. How does this diabetes cause dry eye? Diabetes causes dry eye in every possible way. It causes increased lid infections. It increases the glycosylation. It increases the blood glucose. Polyol pathway is stimulated. It increases the sorbitol. What this sorbitol does is it accumulates in the lacrimal gland. It reduces the function of the lacrimal gland. And basically, you all know, basically diabetes is microangiopathy and neuropathy. So autonomic neuropathy exists in that patient. This new peripheral neuropathy exists in that patient. So autonomic neuropathy, you get the secretion, the parasympathetic stimulation is decreased, and if you have got a peripheral something like the corneal neuropathy, corneal nerves are involved. Basically, you get the trophic effect of the innervation is lost. So basically, all these things contribute to dry eye in a diabetic patient. So use the opportunity of diabetic retinopathy follow-ups and check for the dry eye in diabetics. So when any talk is not complete without associating it with COVID. You have to associate with COVID, then it makes sense. So this one, COVID and dry eye. COVID indeed, I am not making this up. COVID indeed has increased the incidence of dry eye. Why? Because we are all locked down, and children has online classes. My daughter is saying that she sees some videos on the YouTube. Some content providers, they have the number of subscribers for them jump from 1 lakh to 1 million. So basically, people have got nowhere to go. They are staying in homes, and so they are looking at the screens. This has caused increased screen time. So how does the increased screen time cause dry eye? So once you are looking at a thing very concentratedly, automatically your blink rate goes down. And for example, if you are in an AC environment, or if you are a software employee, that reduces the humidity, it causes the dry eye. And this is interesting. Masks have said to cause increase incidence in dry eye. Why? Because once you exhale from a mask, the airflow, it primarily goes above your eyes. Basically, it increases the circulation of air around your eyes, so exacerbating dry eye. So this one, computer vision syndrome. So basically, this slide I want to add because nowadays you see so many of these professionals basically. So one thing difference between a basic dry eye patient coming to you and a computer vision syndrome patient coming to you is, basic dry eye patient comes to you with worsening of the symptoms during the morning, but whereas a computer vision syndrome patient, as the day progresses, he will have symptoms. He will be fine in the morning. He will have symptoms. He will have palpable, this one, interpalpable congestions. He will have as the day progresses. So basically, what I suggest for these patients is, I suggest what is called 20-20-20 principle. Take a break after 20 minutes for 20 seconds. And how do you take this break? Don't look at your computer screen. Look at something at 20 feet. Minimize the usage of your AC. Don't sit next to an AC vent. This is very important. I have seen in so many of these computer professionals, I have seen they have this habit of I have seen one today and I have confirmed with him also. They have this habit of washing their eyes. They feel that there's something in the eyes. It will be better with washing off with cold water. You seek it out and you strongly advise not to do that. And ergonomic viewing of screen, basically what the basically is, you should look down onto your screens. Basically that will narrow the interpalpebral aperture and it will decrease the evaporation. This is interesting. Contact lens and dry eye. Contact lens wearers have threefold increase in the dry eye. So why this occurs? Basically what it does is, when you put on a contact lens, the tear film breaks into a pre-lens and a post-lens thing. So the same thickness is divided into two halves. So automatically the thickness has come down. And the thing is, remember that the contact lens is not a cornea. Cornea is not akin to contact lens. So it has got no mucin, it has no gallico-calyx to attach it. So there is a decreased wettability in that, and normal contact lenses, they increase the friction. So there is decreased wettability, there is increased evaporation, there is increased friction, and all these things, they cause increased dry eye in the corneal lens wearers. So finally, I want to conclude with dry eye is more prevalent than it appears. Seek it out. It could present with increased lacrimation. Tell the patient not to wash his hands to get rid of that foreign body feeling. Not all tear substitutes are same. There are minute nuances among them. Hot compresses and massages work wonders. If you can expand your armamentarium by incorporating new kits like LipiFlow and IPL. A CL intolerant patient may not be fit for a refractive procedure either. Beware of that. You will make your life miserable. So beware of that. Thank you. In the end, I want to thank Ramesh and Oma Maheswar from Cipla for this presentation. I mean, this is my first presentation. They helped me with the slides, with the presentation and everything. Thank you.